Now that the sheep are gone, if you haven't seen Plandemic...
I think this was all planned by the Democratic Party.
Do you believe the numbers and the news that's being reported by the mainstream news media?
You've been brainwashed.
You cannot escape God, not even with the mask or 6 feet.
He's blowing the lid off the COVID scandal, the scamdemic.
There's not enough to make this a pandemic. This is a planned-demic.
YouTube, all these different companies do not like what you're saying.
And if any of you are in the deep state, you're going down with it.
COVID-19 has taken over our lives, but it hasn't been around for very long. Scientists have been studying it in real time as the world collectively goes through a traumatic, world-changing event.
What we do know is, obviously we know it's a coronavirus. We know that it's a strain that partly came from a bat, but it's mixed with something else. And we haven't nailed down exactly what that animal is.
So on the face of it, that's not very reassuring. It's killed more than 500,000 people, but we don't even know exactly where it came from. As a result, conspiracy theories have spread right alongside the virus. And for companies like Google, Facebook, and Twitter, long-standing questions about how they should handle misinformation on their platforms have never been more relevant. Thousands of years ago, people thought epilepsy was a magical, divinely given disease. But around 400 BCE, the Greek physician Hippocrates, or one of his contemporaries, wrote that epilepsy has a natural cause, and its supposed divine origin is due to men's inexperience and to their wonder at its peculiar character. Men continue to believe in its divine origin because they are at a loss to understand it. And 2,600 years later, we are still dealing with that kind of thinking.
The advantage of saying false things is they don't have to be true. And so you can make them nice, easy, pat stories that are really comforting to believe. And that's what makes it really difficult to fight back against, because you're trying to argue against a really simple, easy to understand story that fits your beliefs versus this much more complicated story that isn't going to give you an easy answer.
In places like Brazil, Venezuela, and the US, while there are some leaders promoting a science-based approach, many politicians and people in power are actively promoting misinformation.
We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China.
This cycle that we're doing is not stopping anything. It's not preventing the spread.
Locking down doesn't work.
Here's my evidence. I get a lot of positive calls about it.
In a recent study that's now in preprint, Cornell professor of government Sarah Krebs examined how Americans are handling COVID-19 misinformation.
We found that Americans are really bad at correctly identifying fake news as fake. The more you rely on social media for your news, the more likely you are to be prone to this dynamic where you're not only failing to identify fake news as fake, but the factual information as true.
Misinformation has been around forever, but the internet and social media have made it much harder to counter.
What the internet allows it to do is spread really far, really fast, and hit a lot of people. By the time anyone realizes that it's false and has started to debunk it, it's already spread to maybe millions of people.
There is a scientific process for all of our content. This takes a long time, especially with a new virus. In that time, anyone can create a video and put it on YouTube. It takes 5 minutes.
One study done in March showed that over a quarter of the most viewed YouTube videos on COVID-19 contained misleading information.
In general, what we found in a bunch of studies is that most of the people who believe false news stories do so because they're just not thinking deeply about whether what they're reading is true or false.
Healthy people aren't dying. We're just getting over it like the flu.
Do you see this like the flu?
I see it like the flu. That's exactly what it is. It's a different type of flu.
So what are you saying to the scientists and those who encourage you to keep apart and wear a mask?
They're fearmongers because they don't know.
It's a situation where those with opposing views can be baffled by the other side's inability to see what they're seeing.
There's a tendency for us to think that the people who fall for misinformation are other than us. That kind of we're smarter than everyone else. We wouldn't believe anything that's demonstrably false. And we find that that's just not the case. All of us sometimes fall for misinformation.
Every bit of information you absorb is filtered through your worldview and your cultural values. We are fundamentally fallible, easily fooled humans. And positions on especially important things like evolution or vaccinations or COVID-19 can become not just evaluations of truth, but part of your identity.
It may be the case that at first people have no particular allegiance to any given understanding of what's going on. It's all so new and so fluid, but over time, there will be a kind of convergence. And the worry is that those beliefs, sometimes inaccurate ones or even dangerous ones, become linked to people's worldviews or belief systems.
That's the kind of thing that we're seeing on debates like climate change or nuclear power or the HPV vaccine. Positions on those issues have essentially become symbols of people's membership in and loyalty to groups. And the stake that people have in their standing in the group is a very strong one. And in those conditions, people tend to use their reason to extract from information the parts of it that help them to reinforce the beliefs that are held within their group.
In Sarah Krepp's recent Cornell study, Democrats were consistently more likely to correctly identify a COVID-related headline as true or false than were independents or Republicans. But that doesn't mean Democrats are smarter than independents or Republicans. On average, Republicans and Democrats hold similar levels of science knowledge. But it could suggest that the worldviews of Republicans and independents are more closely aligned with this specific kind of misinformation, and as a result are more likely to accept it as true.
In the mid-90s, there was no relationship between which party you identified with and your beliefs about the reality of climate change. Now that it's a very high-stakes issue, it's so closely linked to partisanship and ideology that it's very hard to unwind that relationship.
And right now, things are getting worse. In April, 47% of Republicans believed that the coronavirus had been made a bigger deal than it really is. By June, that had grown to 63%. Among Democrats, it went from 14 to 18%.